believe we're live. Welcome everyone to the Business of Property on Property Development Australia. Good evening. We have a very special guest, Troyson Bassani, and he is going to be sharing a very I've been very quite excited about this topic about developing Indigenous land. Welcome, Troyson, to the community.
No, hello all, and yeah, thank you, Cheryl, for having me. And yeah, I hope tonight's discussion is of great benefits to you, and going forward, it gives you some context as to how to operate in the Indigenous land space.
Yeah, thank you for being here, Joyce. And I think we spoke earlier in the day, and even before, like when we first connected, I was really keen to understand, this whole topic around, developing Indigenous land, which I mentioned to you. It's not a topic that we as developers, I guess mainstream talk about a lot, or at all. And I think it's to have you and your input in terms of your experience with developing with Indigenous landowners, what you've done, and also the benefits. I think it's going to be fantastic for the community. So to start off with, tell us a little bit about yourself and what it is that you do.
Yeah, so I hail from an Indigenous community in tropical North Queensland, up near the Great Barrier Reef,
Awesome.
called Yarrabah. So I'm a born and bred Queenslander, and I'm a rugby league diehard, unfortunately. So for those who follow rugby league, yeah, much of us people that live up north tend to be diehard rugby league fans. So yeah, I hail from an Indigenous community. Spent most of my life living in North Queensland. Attended university in Brisbane and parts of my high schooling done in Brisbane. And then, yeah, after I left school, I did a lot in the Indigenous um, policy space, Indigenous affairs. I spent a lot of time up working for the Cape York Institute,
Hmm.
and it's one of Noel Pearson's organisations there that services parts of Cape York. And I spent a lot of time there for the last, I'd say, 5 years, 6 years in Indigenous land policy, and made a lot of submissions to government around creating Indigenous land enabling environments for developers as well as investors, essentially getting land investment ready and working directly with traditional landowners as well. And I suppose what sort of moved me into going into development specifically is that I remember being surrounded by a bunch of my colleagues who are all either lawyers or policy writers, and they said, we need more Indigenous developers, right? There's enough of us around this table. There's not enough Indigenous developers. And then, yeah, a light bulb went off in my head, and I sort of branched off into property development and spent the last 4 or so years building my knowledge base around the development process, as well as connecting with like-minded people like yourself over the years. And yeah, that sort of led to me forming an organization called Bassini Property Group, which I manage at the moment. And yeah, we basically have essentially two functions. Um, we work as a boutique buyers agency in central Queensland and across North Queensland under two brands, Capricorn Life and Tropical Life in North Queensland. And then we do developments, small and medium, in these areas, as well as we have a specific focus on developing the Indigenous estate.
Fantastic. And so I guess one of the things, and probably what I've noticed is for a lot of, and I'll just say mainstream developers because I don't know what else to title, but we talk about Indigenous land, and I sort of feel that um, we're a bit hesitant to have to deal with Indigenous land in case there's like we're offending anyone, we're not doing the right thing, and all of that. But it seems like from the conversations we've had, like there is a lot of openness and positivity from the Indigenous community to be able to develop the land that they have. And we spoke about this sort of, it's taken 40 years or whichever. Tell me about that whole openness to develop land and why it's something that that people should be more aware of.
Yeah, sure. I suppose a good starting point would be, yeah, 40 odd years ago, there was a massive sort of essentially a land rights movement where a lot of Indigenous activists and Indigenous groups sort of, created this movement that, they wanted land back, or they wanted rights and interest into land after dispossession and the likes for so many years. And then that led to a landmark hallmark federal court case, Mabo.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was around 1993, and essentially what spiraled out of that was this, form of interest in land called native title.
Mm.
And a lot of clan groups over the last 20 odd years or so have been lodging native title claims, right? They've been lodging native title claims, essentially getting land back or getting interest in land that's traditionally theirs, as well as getting land handed over in the form of, tenure. Um, and that's been happening here for the last 20 years. And it's sort of got to a point now where a lot of those land claims that have been made have sort of been ticked off now, and a lot of land's been given back. So what we're finding is a lot of these Indigenous land owners have, large chunks of land that have this, huge potential, but they don't know what to do with it, right?
Mm.
They don't have the capacity, they don't have the skill set, and they don't have the dollar. They're land rich but cash poor, a lot of these, landholders. And that's where I believe, people like yourself and property professionals can really work alongside Indigenous landowners to unlock that potential that sits there.
Yeah. And I think that's where it is, where we sort of go, I think there's a perception that because it's Indigenous land, that it needs to stay as it is. And that's why for most people, and maybe I'm speaking for myself, but I always had that impression that, okay, if we want to keep it as Indigenous land, how do you develop it?
Yeah. Yeah, no, that's fine. I suppose it's just like, any parcel of land, when you go through the due diligence process, you sort of have a look at, its highest and best use, what are the overlays that sit over there.
Mm,
And, the Indigenous parcel of land is much the same. You sort of look at it on a case by case basis and you go, all right, of this 1 acre block, maybe 50% of it is developable, and we'll leave the other 50% as is, because it has significant cultural
mm,
connection or significance to those landholding groups. So you look at it on a case by case basis. So yeah, people shouldn't shy away from, definitely having that conversation or engaging with landowners, because yeah, there are some parts where you definitely want to shy away from that have higher cultural significance, just like any parcel of land.
mm, mm, mm.
We shy away from, developers shy away from places with high environmental significance, flood overlays, cultural sites, etc., etc. Um, and the same sort of thing would apply, when developing Indigenous land. You look at it on a case by case basis, and talk directly to the landowners and say, all right, which areas should we shy away from developing, and then make a decision as to whether or not that's feasible.
Yeah. And so how do we find Indigenous land? I mean, is there a different zoning to it, or is it, the same sort of zoning? If we were to look at a zoning map, will we be able to identify what that land is?
So there, in the early, I'd say, 1970s, there were a lot of Indigenous clusters,
Mm,
or population clusters or Indigenous communities that were quite discrete, and they're sort of plotted all around Australia, parts of northern Australia, parts of western New South Wales, parts of Northern Territory, as parts of the Pilbara, and even parts of WA. That there are these discrete Indigenous communities or Indigenous population centres, and they have a different form of land tenure arrangements in a lot of these places. So we develop on usually freehold torrents title
mm,
um, type land tenure arrangements, and in a lot of these Indigenous communities, the land tenure arrangements are different, right? So there's been legislation created at a state level called the Aboriginal Land Act, and what's born out of the Aboriginal Land Act is this Indigenous or this Aboriginal freehold tenure,
mm,
and that gives exclusivity to the Indigenous beneficiaries that live there, right? So there is a separate land tenure arrangements in a lot of discrete Indigenous communities, but outside of those Indigenous communities, let's say, where are you? You're in Sydney, right?
Yeah.
I'd say, in parts of the Central Coast, a lot of that land there is, freehold Torrens title. But
Yeah.
what sits as an overlay to that title is native title, which is a sort of a federal law or blanket or a caveat. And that basically states that, Indigenous people have an exclusive right and interest in that parcel of land. So
Mm-hmm.
it's, and, mines, for example, are facing this conundrum all the time when, state are issuing, mining leases out in, parts of the Pilbara, even parts of Queensland, even parts where I'm from here in central Queensland, and state land, right? But what sits as an overlay on state crown land is native title.
Mm.
And in order to sort of get permission to develop that land, you need to get what's called an Indigenous land use agreement with the native title holders. So yeah, it's quite complex when a lot of this baffles a lot of lawyers, and I think this is what sort of deterred a lot of investors and developers away from the Indigenous property space. But once you get your head around it, it's quite simple, right? So yeah, there's these discrete Indigenous land tenure arrangements in certain communities, and then there's this sort of blanket or overlay that sits over um, Torrens title in certain parts of Australia, not all of Australia, in
Yeah.
certain parts where there's been native title claims made. And that, yeah, could potentially stifle or hamper development.
Yeah. And so I mean, is there a standard process that you would follow, or anyone that's sort of going, okay, this sounds really interesting. Where do you start? Like, say I'm in New South Wales, all right, and I go, hey, it sounds like a really interesting opportunity here. Where's the first place I would go to?
Yep. So as I mentioned, when Mabo went through as a landmark a case here in Australia, what that meant was that people who got rights and interest to land, they then needed an administrative body to administer those rights. And what was created was, is called these prescribed body corporates. In
Mm.
the Indigenous space, we call them PBCs. And those PBCs have governance arrangements as well as CEOs there that could act as a direct contact to a developer, right? So let's say developer X wanted to do a development on an Indigenous parcel of land or a discrete Indigenous community under an Aboriginal freehold title. Then they'd connect directly with the landowners, which would be the PBC, the prescribed body corporate, and say, look, we're interested in developing this parcel of land. And then, you go through the usual pitch, and then enter into some sort of joint venture arrangement or, transfer of ownership of land, if you end up, coming to an agreement there with the Indigenous landowner. So yeah, my recommendation would be reach out directly to prescribed body corporates.
Do you just
And
Google it?
yeah, well, in the area that you are dealing with, that'd usually be a land council in that
Yes.
area, and that
Yes.
land council will have a list of all the prescribed body corporates that sit within that area.
Yeah.
And then yeah, you'd be able to speak directly to CEOs, board members, etc., of those body corporates, and they essentially grant you permission as to whether or not you can develop or not on that parcel of land.
And so when you get to that point, do you basically, because I'm thinking, because the way that I would work is I would look at a suburb or an area that I'm looking for, look at a zoning and go, okay, I
Mhm.
think I can, I can develop this, and then I go to the vendor, the owner, and make some sort of an offer. Because going to a PBC, do they have a list, and in which case I'm not privy to that list. Do they have a list and they're like, okay, here's the list, you look legit, we can talk about this land that's available? Is that sort of what the process is? Like, I'm not sure what's like what I'm dealing with to start off with, or is there a way to sort of know what land we're looking at before we even have that conversation with the PBC?
Yeah, I'd certainly just, look at what's feasible first from a development point of view.
Yeah.
So do your own in-house due diligence and feasibility to see if it stacks up initially. And, but I'd do that at a high level, and then I'd certainly
Mm.
approach PBCs and the like, because that's only one layer. And that's usually the hardest layer when you're doing business or doing property development in Indigenous spaces, once you get the tick of approval from the landowner, then you sort of just basically enter into the normal development process, right? You
Yeah.
submit DAs to the local council body, and you get BAs, etc., etc. So that initial tick of approval, you can range from 3 months to 6 months, and so
Mm.
it can prolong the development period to some degree, but it could be done with a solicitor or a native title lawyer, where you get both parties at the table and you say, look, I'm interested in that parcel of land, and if it ticks all their boxes and it ticks all the planning scheme requirements as part of the usual DA process, then you're off and running, really.
Okay. All right. So we've got a few questions popping up here, Troyce, and everyone's
Yep.
sort of going, ooh, ooh. So Sean here, is there a site that lists where highly cultural significant land is for Indigenous people? So I guess I think comes down to, how do we identify these blocks if
Yep.
we're looking in specific
Yep.
areas?
Yeah. So as I mentioned, these prescribed body corporates have CEOs and essentially board members that sit on top of the CEO, and what they're in the process, or a lot of them have, and a lot of them are still doing it, is identifying those sites of high cultural significance, and they're creating land use maps, right, for
Mm.
developers and people that want to do business there, so that when you approach these guys and you're interested in a parcel of land, they have that information in house, land use map, where they basically say, this is the areas that have high cultural significance, and we're not interested in any form of development there. But a lot of PBCs that have only been recently established in the last 5 years or so are sort of still going through that process of establishing what are the sites of high cultural
Mm-hmm.
significance, what are
Mm.
the sites that we're open to developing, and then creating these land use maps.
Okay, so the big question is, considering there's almost sort of another layer that we have to go through with development, and we know development in general can take, once it goes to council, a bit of time. What
Yeah.
are the pros of doing this? What is the benefit?
Yeah. Well, I suppose if you're going to do business there, you want to do it the right way. A lot of the mines, unfortunately, in Australia haven't done that. The mines
Mm.
that have developed Indigenous land have sort of tried to avoid the process of, getting Indigenous land use agreements in place with landowners. And, there's been multiple times now where I think recent legislation has passed um, allowing for um, miners to bypass Indigenous landowners for approval to conduct mines, or to develop mines. So you want to do it the right way, and you want to get local buy-in, right?
Mm.
So it's of great benefit to do things the right way there, and it could be a long process, or it could be a short process, um, as long as the conversation happens and you go through the process. Yeah, it's fine. And like I said, it could be done with a simple native title lawyer, or one of your solicitors, and getting both parties at the table and coming up with an arrangement to develop.
Yeah. And one of the things that I've noticed as well is and from the conversations that we've had, is that um, Indigenous landowners are open to JVs.
Yeah, well, as I touched on, at the beginning, is that the last 40 years they've been fighting for land, and now that they've got all this land back, they don't know what to do with it. So they're land rich and cash poor. So a lot of them are quite open to the fact that, look, we don't have money, and it's quite complex to get money, and it's difficult to get money. So, how can we partner with people that do have money in
Mm.
order to do something on our land?
Mm.
And that's the value add that a lot of developers will be able to bring to the table. And you just go through once you have an agreement at a high level in place, then you just go through the usual JV process as per your development that you do on parts of Western Sydney.
Okay. Okay. And is it right to assume, or probably not assume, but generally the land is unencumbered? Like there's
Yes.
no mortgage on it or anything else, because it's okay.
Yeah.
Yep.
Yeah. You'll find that a lot of land that's been passed back,
Yep.
a lot of it was state land, right? And it's been handed back to Indigenous landowners and held in trust under the prescribed body corporates. And yeah, all of it is usually unencumbered.
Okay.
There would be parcels of lands that have been sliced up, and someone's been granted a 99-year residential lease or have a
Yeah.
freehold block within the communally owned land title arrangements. But yeah, other than that, you'd find that most of it is certainly unincumbent.
Okay. And can we just go back to that tenure again? Um, does it depend on where it is as to whether it's freehold or leasehold?
Yep, absolutely. So as I mentioned, that there are all these discrete Indigenous communities or clusters of Indigenous people around certain parts of Australia, and a lot of the time, the population centres are in sort of regional remote areas.
Mm.
Um, so the land tenure arrangements there are different. So that it's basically like you look at a map and you hover over the Indigenous community, and it's like a circle's been drawn around it to say that anything inside of this is in Aboriginal freehold, and that's essentially exclusive tenure or title to the Indigenous beneficiaries that live there. And once you cross that line, it's usually you enter into just your fee simple torrents title sort of tenure. But tenure in Indigenous communities is quite complex, land tenure arrangements.
Mm.
Within those, as I mentioned, it's only really been set up for exclusive use of Indigenous beneficiaries, and how a third party can essentially come in, or a developer to develop there, is by basically slicing a chunk out of that, and usually what happens there is you are either granted a 99-year lease, or you have an arrangement with the landholders that they sell you a chunk of it, and the title is changed from Aboriginal freehold to fee simple freehold.
Okay. And so is it generally that you'd find the land in remote or regional areas? I mean, can you expect to find it in metro cities?
No, that wouldn't be the case. A lot of the land that's been handed back to Indigenous people tends to sit within the regional and remote areas,
Mm.
and a lot of the metro areas, yeah, the built-up areas, yeah, land tenure arrangements here is, what we deal with today, fee simple freehold, and a lot of the time in those metro areas, built-up areas, native title has also been extinguished, so native
Yeah.
title doesn't sit there as an overlay.
Mm.
Only in these rural and remote areas that native title sits there, because um, any concrete slab that's been laid in Australia that predates the native title case of Mabo in 1993 actually extinguishes native title. So that rules out all of the metro areas in
Yes.
Australia. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That makes sense. So, um, in saying that, then, what can we expect to be developing in these areas? Is it generally residential land subdivisions? I think you mentioned commercial, possibly industrial as well.
Yeah, certainly. All of those three opportunities do sit within the Indigenous estate. What's been happening, particularly in those rural and remote areas, is that there's been a lot of residential development, but obviously that's been done by the state through social housing.
Mm.
But there is a large demand for home ownership residential. Providing an alternative housing option to the residents that live there that are unemployed and are working and are functional families, and giving them an option, yeah, to buy. And that's where the government actually doesn't really step in and work in this space, right? They just want to continue to build social housing, and that's where the private sector and mainstream developers could come in and develop residential subdivisions
Mm.
for people that aspire to be homeowners. So those opportunities are there. There are a plethora of commercial opportunities. I recommend, if you're in the hotelier business, there are parcels of land under the Indigenous estate of Australia that, yeah, have, some really good potential there for resorts and for eco resorts, and just your general commercial opportunities, your retail hubs and your service stations. The list goes on there. So there are a lot of those opportunities that exist there in these
Yeah.
communities. Yeah, you just need to, yeah, connect with the right people and, yeah, unlock some of those opportunities.
Excellent. So, are you able to share with us the projects that you've done and gone through this process, because it'd be really interesting to understand like what your journey has been and what you've been able to put together.
Yeah, sure. So, it started, much like how you go about, identifying a site. So I sort of, identified this Indigenous community that, where I'm from in North Queensland had a shortage of housing, so
Yeah.
there's a huge demand for, residential lots. And yeah, I hovered over the planning scheme and sort of had a look of, what areas did have development potential there and identified a parcel of land. And basically then I started a conversation with the landowners to essentially get their blessing or their permission
Mhm.
to go ahead and do this development. And what we come up with was an Indigenous land use agreement. And that essentially, gives me the permission to go ahead and do a residential subdivision there. And yeah, once that process was done, and what's built into that is simple things like, there could be a percentage of the profits that's shared to the landowners. It could be
Mhm.
job opportunities during construction to the local people that are there. It could be discounts on retail rates of the end product. Those sort of things that are worked into the agreement, and I got the blessing of the landowners there. And once I got that Indigenous land use agreement in place, I just basically went through the usual development process in doing a 11 lot subdivision
Right.
in an Indigenous community called Yarrabah in North Queensland.
Excellent. And so what's the arrangement that you had in that situation with the traditional landowners? Are they holding a few of those blocks or?
Yeah, so it was a combination of getting a discounted retail rate
Mhm.
on the end product for the people that are there, some job opportunities, particularly at a labour capacity during the construction phase, and yeah, a small portion of the profits as well were shared to the landowners there as well. So that's the
Okay.
arrangement I had in place with them, and yeah, that was um, all sort of rolled into what was called a ILUA, an Indigenous Land Use Agreement. And yeah,
Excellent.
and I paid what was it, roughly 25,000 per block raw.
Right. Okay.
Yeah,
Okay. And
on
what would
top
they?
of on
Yeah.
top of
What?
the land use arrangement. Yeah,
What would
document.
they sell for?
They'd sell for about 170.
Okay.
Yeah.
Alrighty. Excellent. So you in this situation, it wasn't really a JV so much. It doesn't sound like it was.
No, it wasn't a JV. It was more or less that they were the landowners.
Mm,
I essentially took the land changed title, changed ownership to my organisation. We did the
mm.
development. We come up with a land use agreement, and then we went through the usual DA process with the local council that was there.
Okay. And sort of the consideration for them instead of cash or anything was the discounts um and the percentage profits and all as well.
Yeah, that was built into the Indigenous land use agreement, and then I paid essentially 25,000
Oh yeah,
per block. Yeah,
okay.
yeah.
Okay. Excellent. And how long did that whole process take from when you initially started your conversation with the landowners and then when it was sort of approved and ready to go?
So that process, I initially floated the idea in an informal conversation to a traditional landowner at first, and then that led to me doing a formal presentation to the board about this potential opportunity there.
Yeah.
So I floated the idea. This would have been uh, about 3 years ago.
Mm,
Um, we had an informal conversation initially, and then I presented to the board probably about 3 months after our initial conversation. And yeah, I got their blessing probably 2 months after I presented to the board, got an ILUA signed off, and then entered into the development process. So the from basically ideation to this, the handing over of the keys to those lots, uh, you know, I'd say altogether just over a year.
okay. All right. It's pretty standard
Yeah, yeah,
anyhow.
yeah.
If anything, that's probably pretty quick because development applications can take depending on which council you
Yeah,
deal
yeah.
with.
Well, a lot of these Indigenous councils, they don't, get too many of these type of requests. So
Yes,
yeah,
yeah.
they can tend to speed up the process there.
But then does it still go through the local council as well?
Yes, yeah, correct. Yeah.
Yeah.
So a lot of the councils have in-house planners that work for them, and yeah, they usually approve those type of arrangements, or that's outsourced to a to a consultant that
Thank
would
you.
advise them on certain matters that
Excuse me.
yeah, you're right.
My daughter. My
Yeah,
daughter's
so a
just
lot of
saying
those
goodnight.
councils do have that capacity in-house. Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Excellent. So it doesn't seem that there's a huge amount of competition in the space.
Yeah, like I said, I think what's happened over the last 10 years, given those places that have had land handed back to them, was a lot of them didn't know what to do with it, and a
Mm,
lot of the land tenure arrangements or land titling arrangements sort of scared investors and developers into the place.
mm,
Um, but once people understand how to do business there, the process becomes quite simple. But as you mentioned, yeah, there's no one sort of doing business in the space, and I think it's purely out of a lack of information or a lack of
yeah,
how to do business there. But once you understand that, it can be quite simple.
excellent. And funding. I mean, is there any difference or are there any hurdles with financing these projects?
Well, in certain remote indigenous areas, you'd need a transferable type lease or a transferable type land arrangement there to obviously have land that's bankable and tradable.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, you wouldn't have an issue getting funding in those areas, but yeah, that's obviously going to be on a case by case basis. A lot of the mainstream banks do shy away from lending in those rural and remote areas, but a lot of people don't understand that. That's why the Indigenous, essentially I call it the Indigenous Bank, but IBA, the Indigenous Business Australia,
Okay.
was set up to provide finance to those that aspire to home ownership or development in Indigenous communities, and they can essentially provide home loans or pre-approved mortgages for residential developments. So yeah, that's a form of finance that people can get the customers themselves. But yeah, in terms of developers, yeah, if you're a mainstream developer and you're trying to get mainstream finance to do a development in an Indigenous community, it can be quite challenging. Yeah,
Mm,
given the land tenure arrangements. But a lot of what I'm finding is a lot of the regional areas, the mainstream banks are more than willing to lend for development purposes, given that there is tradability and security, for them.
yeah, okay. So for your project with the 11 lot subdivision, was it a bank or was that through the Indigenous Bank of Australia? Is that IBA?
Yeah, IBA, yeah,
Mm,
correct. So it was through the Indigenous Bank of Australia, IBA,
yeah.
Indigenous Business Australia, and essentially what happened was, they were 11 pre-approved mortgages, and that underwritten my construction loan for the development.
Okay.
Yeah, and it
Right.
was an
So
arrangement I had, yeah, with Indigenous Business Australia.
okay. So that was one of the questions. How is the market for property development finance for Indigenous property? Do banks lend for such projects? Which banks or lenders would do that? Um, so are they the only lender that you're aware of at the moment? Considering I'd say they're considered a bank as opposed to a private lender.
Yeah, so they'd lend to a developer given you had a joint venture arrangement in place with an Indigenous landholder, or an entity was set up, under a joint venture arrangement. That could definitely pass the criteria there, because you have to be an Indigenous recognized business in order to
Okay.
receive, finance
Mm,
from those from that organization. But as I mentioned, yeah, a lot of the really remote places, you'd find it very challenging to get finance from obviously mainstream sources. But yeah, definitely in some of the regional areas, there's opportunities there. And from my experience, the mainstream banks or mainstream finances are willing to lend on Indigenous land in those more regional centres.
Yeah, excellent. So where would you say, and because you're a buyer's agent as well, so I'm aware of that, if someone was interested in developing, I mean, where are the sort of centers you'd say here are some opportunities to sort of start educating yourself about?
Yeah, well, we were having a conversation earlier that, on parts of the Central Coast, there's been, some local development there by Indigenous landholders. So it all depends on, I suppose, how ready or how functioning or how good the capacity is on the ground by those prescribed body corporates and where they're at in their administrative cycle. So a lot of the ones that are well established now, 5 to 10 years or so, a lot of them now are in a really good position to sort of move into that development phase.
Yeah.
So it'd be as simple as connecting with those guys going forward, finding out what opportunities do sit there. Um, so there's parts of the Central Coast, Northern Australia. There's a lot of Indigenous land. I'd say 99, not 99. I'd say 95% of it or more has an Indigenous right or interest that sits on it.
Yeah.
Certainly in Northern Australia, parts of Northern Territory, which is quite obvious, parts of the Central Coast of New South Wales, even parts of Western New South Wales, parts of SA, parts of Western Victoria, and all along the Pilbara and WA also. There are areas of really high Indigenous interest or land ownership.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. The next question was, what sort of return on investment can a developer get on their investments? Probably a question that's, how long is a piece of string? I guess it comes down to just how you negotiate with each of the different parcels of land.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, because in those remote areas, obviously, construction costs and freight and materials is usually quite high, so it tends to blow out a lot of feasible opportunities that are potentially sit there. One of the things that I'm finding that's coming up in the last 3 years or so is that if you do have a potential solution to a problem on the ground or a demand on the ground in these Indigenous communities, the government will incentivize you to go in there and solve that problem for them. And they will reward you through instruments like social impact bonds. So although the project may not initially stack up, you're then rewarded through a social impact bond, for example, for going in there and building 20 houses that the government didn't want to build or didn't have the capacity to build or the money to build. You built it for them. You've created a cost saving for the government. You're given in return, um, some money from the government for providing them with a cost saving through a social impact bond arrangement. So
Yeah.
I'm finding that's been happening, and that's been coming up with a lot of my conversations with high level bureaucrats and ministers in that space. Is if you go in and you're creating a solution to a problem, and a lot of Indigenous communities, they want to create jobs. They have a high demand for housing. And if you're going in there and you're creating retail spaces, you're building commercial opportunities for people, and you're providing alternative housing to social housing, then that ticks the government's boxes, right? And you'll be well incentivized to do so. So you may not get initially the ROI may not look good on paper, given the costs and the remoteness of doing business in some of these places, but you'll be well incentivized to do business there, and you'll be well rewarded through these instruments that the governments are rolling out.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And so is it then that is there a specific target market that when you're developing these projects, is it going to be mainly targeted towards the Indigenous community, or is it really sort of, you're creating a product that is mainstream but just so happens to be Indigenous land?
Yeah, I think that'll be on a case by case basis. Obviously, there'll be opportunities, that are, completely remote where and isolated, that it'll be only for the beneficiaries there locally. But in some of those more, metro areas or regional centres, a lot of the Indigenous communities sort of intersect with a lot of other regional towns,
Mm.
and usually 1 or 2 hours away from capital cities, right? So it's just, you treat it on a case by case basis, have that conversation to say that, hey, look, we've identified that there's this parcel of land on that you have that could be of great commercial benefit, or we could look at doing a residential subdivision there. However, we want that to be available for everyone, not just the beneficiaries that sit there. And then you have that conversation with the landowners. And once you get their blessing in regards to that, then yeah, you're free. But it is a challenging conversation to have because, as I
Yeah.
mentioned, a lot of people have fought for land for the last 40 years, and they can be quite reluctant to hand it over.
Yes.
But in saying that, there are a lot of progressive prescribed body corporates and Indigenous leaders that see development as being a great economic and social benefit in some of these places.
Yeah, absolutely. We've got a few more questions here. They're coming through.
Yep.
Sean says, hypothetically, an Indigenous owner of land in these remote areas, would they be able to develop their land for themselves without any outside bordering council approval, sorry, if it was purely for their own community? I guess sort of almost like what, a self-certification type process. Is that what you're meaning, Sean? Because he's talking about not having any sort of influence from council.
Yeah. Well, what sort of happened in the last 10 years or so is that a lot of councils now have their own, local planning schemes, and you have to abide by the planning scheme as anywhere else in Australia. But prior to that, there was some autonomy with landowners that they could go out and build a beach shack, right on the water
Mm.
somewhere. But now, the planning scheme prohibits that, and waters down those, that autonomy that people had to develop land. Um, but in saying that, people are the landowners, but they have to just abide by the planning scheme. They don't have the free reign to do that anymore, unfortunately.
Yeah, they just can't be building shacks
Yeah,
everywhere.
correct.
Yeah. Okay. No, Sean. So no. Yeah, you still have to go through the same process as everyone else. Cool. All right, we've got some other questions on the Facebook. Um, okay, we answered the question about the tenure.
Yeah. Oh,
Uh,
just on that though, Cheryl, real quickly.
yeah.
Um, so those prescribed body corporates or Indigenous landowners, they could essentially be their own developers, right?
Mm,
They can get finance from, the Indigenous Bank of Australia, IBA, but they just don't have the capacity in house. So, someone like Sean bring the skill set
yes.
and his knowledge base to the table, and work with them in house in building up their capacity to execute a development.
Yeah.
They'd have autonomy, complete autonomy to do that, providing they go through the planning provisions.
Okay, so basically when you're talking about the knowledge and expertise in actually delivering a project, sort of almost like a development management
Correct. Yeah.
type arrangement. Okay. Yeah. Yeah. Um, yeah, that's really interesting. So, what I'd like to, and I'm just trying to look at my notes to see if there's anything there that I haven't covered. Um, do 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 do. Okay. Yeah, I think it's just it's one of those things. I'm really glad that we're able to bring light to it. But the one thing I want to highlight as well, I guess it's not just developers who are dealing with Indigenous land. It's like sort of developers just in metro areas, and this is one of the reasons why we also connected. Was, is there anything that we can do as just mainstream developers to give respects or at least acknowledge customs and our native landowners in the things that we're doing in the big cities?
Yeah. Yeah, that's right, and it's quite. It saddens me that people, the Indigenous people that let's say local to Mossman in Sydney, you know, they've been dispossessed of that land, and it's unfortunate that they don't have the opportunity to participate in any capacity, or they haven't had the opportunity to participate in capacity probably for the last 50 years or so.
Yeah.
They were sort of locked out from those opportunities. But now going forward, maybe you can look at bringing them into the fold, because the land was occupied by them prior to that. So it'd be good to, I think you done a lovely thing, was naming a project after a local Indigenous language name in that area.
Yeah.
So simple things like that, just be good to know, if you're developing on a parcel of land, what tribal group, essentially connects to that parcel of land,
Yeah.
and whether or not, you might even want to name a building or a dwelling after a local native Indigenous group, and get them to participate in the process. But yeah, I think simple things, go a long way, even from a social, impact point of view.
Mm.
In any returns, you might want to see who the local Indigenous organisation is in town or in that area that, you may
Mm.
be willing to donate a portion of your profits towards, those organisations that are doing some really good work in the community. So
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah.
there are a lot of things that you can do to sort of give back or engage Indigenous people in the development process,
Mm.
um, whether it is through naming of sites or giving back to the community or
Mm.
having them involved.
Yeah, and even we're looking to organize a smoking ceremony as well, and we're not talking about joints here, but an Indigenous smoking ceremony when the project sort of kicks off as well. So just little things like that. It's recognizing, because I do feel that in the development world we are detached from that so much, and to be able to bring it back into our awareness as developers, to sort of go, hey, we do have a connection uh, um, to Indigenous land, and what are the little things that we can do to just recognize that. um, and I know that, see, even in schools and all of that, that there's the verse which recognizes that we are on traditional land.
Yeah, and I think America has been probably a bit more progressive and have done it a little bit better than what
Oh,
we have in
okay.
Australia.
How
Well,
so?
some of their residential estates in America and some of their commercial infrastructure, have some sort of relationship or connection to the Indigenous tribal groups that are there, whether it's through names, whether it's through a form of ownership. But I know a lot of big residential estates in America have been given tribal names. Residential estates. Tribal names. So they've been a little bit more, I suppose, culturally conscious in
Yes.
America, and that can be done here. It can be done here if you're doing a big 100-lot subdivision on the fringes of Western Sydney. Um, you may even consider doing something like that, and then upon when you're looking at going into sales or launch, doing a smoking ceremony like what you've done.
Yeah.
And then if it was a lucrative project, then potentially giving back to the community also.
Yeah, I really, really like that. Those are some really, really good points there. Excellent. Any other questions coming from our audience here today? I know I have heaps. However, we are coming up to a good sort of hour of us having a chat, Troyson. Uh, what are the best ways for people to get in contact with you if they're keen to obviously know more, engage you as well, to be able to find suitable sites as well? Like I said, I don't know very many people that have developed in Indigenous land, so you would be a great resource to have, and someone in the team.
Yeah, sure. Feel free to connect with me directly on Facebook. I think you've tagged me in,
Yes.
a few of the posts there. So yeah, if you're interested, guys, or want to know a little bit more, it's touched on a couple of really complex sort of topics tonight, particularly around land titling and finance, etc., markets, viability, feasibility
Yeah.
in some of these communities. So yeah, I can spend hours upon hours unpacking that in further detail with you. So feel free to connect with me, directly on Facebook. I'm on LinkedIn as well. I think It's in the notes. You can connect with me there directly. And then under my 2 regional brands, I can be contacted directly on capricornlife.com.au or tropicallife.com.au, and they're my buyers agency brands that operate in my regional locations in Rockhampton and North Queensland.
Excellent. With your buyers agency business, any particular type of product or that you're looking out for your clients? Typically, are they land subdivisions? Are they looking for townhouses? Do you
Yeah,
have a focus?
I've been doing a lot of work for developers,
Mhm.
essentially spotting sites and then handing over sites to developers, not only here in Central Queensland, North Queensland also, and parts of Brisbane, Gold Coast, and Moreton Bay also. I have
Excellent.
a really good relationship there with agents, and I got a really strong referral base of opportunities and sites that come up there, and yeah, I'll pass those on to my clients as well before they sometimes hit the market, which is a good value
Fantastic.
add I try to bring to the table to these guys. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Well, thank you so much for your time. It's been fantastic. Great. A lot of interesting questions. It's really gotten people really thinking a little bit more about, what are we doing? Are there other opportunities as well? So appreciate you sharing, Troyson. All the best. I love the interaction in the community group as well. So keep that up. And anyone that wants to get in contact, Choices, I did tag him on the Facebook post, so feel free to PM him if you've got more questions.
Yeah, thanks guys. And yeah, like a couple of simple takeaways if I were to, retouch on it was that yeah, there is, this different form of tenure that exists in Indigenous communities, and there is this sort of overlay or blanket overlay that sits on certain chunks of land in Australia too, and that's called native title. You have native title, and then you have Aboriginal freehold. And yeah, once you get your head around those 2 things, doing business in Indigenous communities becomes very, very easy.
Fantastic. Can't wait to explore what the opportunities are. Thank you, Troyson. Have a good night. Stay safe, and everyone, thank you very much for being here. And keep well. Thanks so much.
Thanks, guys.
Ciao.
Cheers,
Bye.
Cheryl. Bye.